everyone. My name is Nihal. I'm writing at Essentials Edge and building at Deeprise. And today I'm so happy to host Philip together with Celine.
And I am Celine, and I'm a data scientist at Apple based in San Francisco. And we think of this series as like a kitchen table for curious minds like founders and investors, future builders across continents, or whoever is interested in. So we have this set up here today. I think I can get things started and give a little bit of context. And today you will hear us skip over the surface level questions, and we are assuming you already understand the basics like data centers, GPUs, or in satellite communications, etc. And today we want to uncover the why now this big of a change and initiation. And today's guest is building one of the world's first orbital data center companies. And welcome to the show, Philip Johnston, and founder of Starcloud.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let me try to describe as simply as I can what Starcloud is building. And of course, Philip will explain it in much detail in a moment, but just to set the stage. So it's like imagine a floating factory in orbit, but not just a satellite pinging signals back and forth, but a full-blown compute hub. Think solar rings, GPU cores, autonomous systems, like running AI workloads in space. That's what Starcloud is building, a compute factory in orbit. So with that picture in mind, Philip, could you walk us through what a space-like-based data center actually looks like? Is it like a single floating container? Or basically, how is it similar, maybe widely different from what we have on Earth, like here in the desert in Utah, maybe?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, maybe there's a few different stages before we get to these very large data centers. I think I can start with what the very long-term sort of multi-gigawatt data centers look like, if that's helpful, and then work back. So for a very large data center, for example, a 5 gigawatt data center, you're going to need around 100 of these 50 megawatt modules. Each module is going to be what you can launch on one full Starship payload base. So the big difference there's two big differences between a terrestrial data center and a space-based data center. The first is in space, obviously, you don't have gravity, so you don't need to build in this form factor where everything is supported from the base. And the second is you only have launch capacity for about 100 tons with the Starship new launch vehicle that's coming online. So everything needs to be shipped up in these 100-ton sized modules. So yeah, the concept that we have for the larger data center is in the center we'll have a core which a bunch of modules plug into. So these will look like almost like large shipping containers, which on the end have a docking port. So this docking port will plug into a central spine. And in fact, if people want to see a video of this, a sort of concept video of this, they can go to starcloud.com, and on the front page of the website, we have this concept video of this, these modules docking into a central spine. And then from there, out comes this absolutely enormous solar panel with a radiator built in on the back side of it. And so for a 5 gigawatt data center, you're looking at around a 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer solar panel with around a 1 kilometer by 4 kilometer radiator on the backside to reject all of that waste heat. So yeah, that's the main difference in terms of what it looks like. For the smaller versions, so we're launching a demonstrator satellite, which is much smaller, so like a 60 kilogram small sat the size of a fridge that's going to launch in November. That will be the first to have high-powered GPUs, particularly H100s from NVIDIA on board. And the purpose of that is just to prove that our radiation shielding and thermal management techniques allow us to operate terrestrial data center grade GPUs in space. But yeah, essentially we scale up every year, 5 to 10x the size each year until we get to, in the early 2030s, this huge 40 megawatt module that can be connected together in space to form a mega structure. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's super interesting, very cool. I think, Nihal, you wanna ask a follow-up question?
I think you already answered that one, so we can...
Okay, cool. Okay, so it's great. I love that visual. It's like it's massive, and it's I think progressively like increasing the size every year. And so the reality of building that type of something like that must be wild. So my second question is, how do you shrink all that down into something you can launch, and making it modular, upgradable, and resilient? A little bit more detailed, actually, that you actually touched on this. I know, but if you think about the trade-offs or design choices you had to have, if any, along the way, can you talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So in order, as you mentioned, you can't launch this whole 5 gigawatt data center together in one go. And so it needs to be broken down into these manageable chunks. And we think it's around 40 or 50 megawatts per 100-ton Starship launch. So that each one of those modules initially will contain everything that it needs to be self-sustaining and self-sufficient. So each module will have enough solar panels and radiators to sustain that module on its own. And so even if you didn't hook them up in space, you would have, the modules of being able to operate on their own and provide a useful service. But yeah, essentially inside the racks, you have coolant coming from the radiators from an outside loop that connects to an inside loop. That coolant then runs past the chips. And then, and it's very similar to the way that liquid cooling on chips, direct-to-chip liquid cooling works today. That is pushed back out to the radiators. And then, so essentially we're providing power cooling and connectivity to these chips, and then everything else is done by. We hope to partner with somebody who's going to actually operate the data center themselves, but it shouldn't be too different an environment than a terrestrial environment in that regard.
Actually, there are so many follow-up questions popping in my mind, but I'm going to just a little bit rewind and ask you the origin story in a way. When you started the fundraise together with your team, it's always the first check writer who kicks it off, right? Then you start taking a momentum, and you were very, happy and grateful for your first check coming from Robert, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe Robert, if I'm not mistaken.
Russell Long was the guy.
Russell Long, sorry. And actually, what I am interested in, once you have created this conviction and hooked one person, probably he said, this is either genius or insane. Either way, I am in. I trust you guys. And afterwards, when you take a look into the memos, investment memos, what was the part that challenged you the most in terms of risk component? And then how did you turn things around and made this such a wave? You end up with 200 plus investors knocking on your door. Can we get in?
So usually they don't show us the investment memos. So actually, I don't really know what is in those investment memos. I can tell you what the top 5 complaints that people have are. And you the first time you pitch, you hear one of these things, you roughly have an idea. But what I do is every time I hear a new question, I add a slide to the back of the deck. And so by the time I've done 5 or 6 pitches, I basically have a slide for every possible, objection that people have on the idea. But the top 5 are, how are you going to keep this thing cold? Because space is a vacuum and it's very difficult to dissipate heat in a vacuum. How are you going to make the chips work in a high radiation environment? How do you handle the problem of orbital debris and micrometeorites hitting such a large structure? How do you handle security, data security, or physical security from adversaries? And how do you handle the regulatory environment for permitting such a large structure in space? So essentially, you have to have a well thought through and plausible, an actually good answer to all of these points. Otherwise, you're not going to get very far. I won't run through that whole list, but unless you want me to, I'm very happy to if you want me to. But maybe I'll wait for the questions, and then when people have questions. Oh, the last one is how do you handle maintenance when you don't have access for 5 years? So that's number 6 maybe.
And also these are top questions with Celine too. When we sit down together, we were like, okay, if we were to check writers, what would we really wanted to make sure about it? So we're gonna come to
Yeah, and then lastly, how have you proved that what's your commercial validation? How have you proved that there's people that actually want to pay for this? And then people say, another one is people say, what's the competitive landscape? what's to stop somebody like SpaceX or Blue Origin doing this? Isn't there other people doing data centers in space? Yeah, actually, there's probably like 20 different questions that people ask that you have to have a pretty coherent answer to. But I would say though, the first time we pitched to Russell, I didn't have a good answer to any of those. So, I mean, I'm still pretty grateful that I think he might have actually been the very first investor call I took, and he wrote the first check. And I thought after he wrote that check, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be the easiest fundraise ever. And then it was not that much easier from then on. Anyway.
Yeah, I assume so. But also, as a side comment, Philip, because during this session, we started to reach out to folks and then invited them. You are one of the very rare founders that people start sentences. Oh, I love Philip. Oh, I love Philip. I would like a conversation, but I'm traveling. Or what can you let me know? Because I also happen to hear the founders you have to that get into YC, and this give back mentality of yours is really amazing. Kudos to you for that.
Thanks very much. That's fun.
You're blushing a little bit here.
Awesome. So I'd like to actually take us back to the previous question, because I think Greg has a pretty good question that I wanna, follow up with. So he asks, what's your expected mission life for a module? And how do you intend to dispose of modules at the end of life? And how are you looking at the life cycle management, basically?
Yeah. So the chip.
Yeah, what do you do when they die, and how do you maintain, basically? Does that process look like?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, because the CAPEX, actually, the biggest expense in everything that we're doing is the same as the expense in a terrestrial data center, which is actually the cost of the chips. And so one of the biggest levers in making the business case close is the depreciation timeline, as in how long are these chips going to generate cash for you, and like at what rate does the cash they generate decline over time. So no, it's a super important question. But so in a terrestrial data center, chips last between 4 or 5 years. They have a useful life of about 4 or 5 years. We expect it to be similar in space. And in fact, there's a case to be made that it might be slightly longer, because we don't have an oxygen atmosphere, which is quite corrosive. We have a zero marginal cost of energy. So running them longer doesn't cost us as much as it does terrestrially. And we also don't have some environmental factors like earthquake tremors, which can make things fail over time. We do have radiation, but over time, the radiation doesn't. The larger the satellite, the less of a problem radiation becomes. So essentially 5 years for the chips. The infrastructure can last longer than that, though. The radiators, solar panels, and for networking infrastructure can last a bit longer, on the order of between 10 and 15 years. And so that's why we have this dock-in, dock-out architecture for the later versions. For the initial versions, we are expecting not to reuse the solar panels and radiators for more than the 5-year lifetime. So the first few satellites, after they finished working, will be the same as Starlink satellites. So they'll demise in the upper atmosphere on re-entry, essentially. For later versions, if we have the extremely large 100-ton versions, it may become a problem to make things demise in the upper atmosphere. And at that point, either we put them in what's called a graveyard orbit, an orbit where they're not going to cause any problem, or we re-enter them with the Starship launch vehicle, which will have the capacity to re-enter various things. Won't be too cheap to start with, but over time, I think that cost will come down.
Yeah, actually, we kind of covered comprehensively when Philip was mentioning part of the sections, how you do the launches and then how you take care of the residual parts. One of the questions that when you're explaining, let's assume something went wrong. What is the backup plan? What do you trigger immediately, minute 1 or the first 60 minutes? And then because it's not like I'm going to take my tool set and go to the data center. And so once let's say, I am certain that you have robust backup at the same time, the handling part, but also on top of this, how are you gonna fix things up there? Either autonomous robots or then just putting somebody up there and then fixing it. This sounds like science fiction, but the more I read about it, the more I'm convinced. This part I couldn't find when I Googled.
Yeah. the orbital maintenance part or maintenance on orbit part is an interesting question as well. So for the first few iterations of the satellite, we're not going to have access to it. So it will be very similar to the way that a Starlink satellite works, for example, which is that you have redundancy on the critical systems, triple redundancy in certain instances, and then you have over provisioning on aspects that you expect to degrade gracefully over time. For example, the solar panels and the radiators, you make them slightly larger than they need to be, so that if you're losing about 2% per year on the efficiency on the solar panel. So by the end of life, you still have enough power to power the whole module. So for the first 3 or 4 satellites, that will be the approach. There will be no access to the data center on space. So you just have to operate like any other satellite. Over time, the space industry is moving towards robotic maintenance. You see this on the International Space Station, but also on other missions. And actually, terrestrial data centers are also moving towards robotic maintenance. I had a conversation with somebody recently who said, it wouldn't be surprising if within 5 years we see humanoid robots maintaining terrestrial data centers. And I personally think that makes sense. The interesting thing about humanoid robots is they actually operate with basically zero modification in space. So if you put a humanoid robot in a spacesuit, that takes care of thermal management and radiation shielding. So, it wouldn't surprise me. This does sound a little bit sci-fi, I admit, but it wouldn't surprise me if on the order of 5 years we start seeing humanoids building structures in space. We're not reliant on that, but that's my hunch of where this thing's going.
So then you have 5 key designs principles on your white paper that you highlighted, and one of them is about the modularity. So then you say, actually, we do it such a modular way. If one fails, the other still can get into the loop and then sustain the thing.
Yes.
And at the same time, correct me if I am wrong, you would also need some facilities on Earth too, but not as big as typical data centers, but just to be able to maintain. How big do you plan to cover on your initial launches?
When you say facilities on Earth, what do you mean by that?
Are they, in order to make the connections in a more sustained way and in order to have the entire network run? Maybe I may be also mistaken too, but that's my understanding when I did a bit of research.
That's a good question too, but we're not going to be doing our own data backhaul. So we will I have to be a little bit careful because we're under NDA, but we will very likely be using one of the mega constellations for our own data backhaul. And that means, we don't, we won't need to rely on ground stations or use or rely on our own inter-satellite connectivity to get data back to and from the satellite. So I don't think we'll have a ground footprint at all, really, except for example, this facility behind me.
Got it. But then actually it brings me to the question of cost efficiency, because one of the not a radical approach, but in comparison to all the other space startups, I find it a little bit radical, the way that you iterate very often and you aim to keep those cycles as short as possible. But then that brings the question to mind, in order to have these iterations, I need to break it down to the really small parts. At the same time, I need to have a runway that supports me, right? So can you a little bit help us understand, how do you balance this? And at the same time, does your cap table also back this up in a way? They don't expect returns in shorter times, but then they are happy to see, as long as the momentum and the results are promising, and they will respect your cadence, your pace of building it, because it's very much team-based, depending on what company you're looking at.
That's a good that's a good question. Or it's something we think a lot about, is how it's quite a CAPEX heavy business, especially at the beginning, and so there's a few different approaches. One is you can spend an enormous amount of CAPEX building something very elaborate, and then 4 years later launch it and hope it works. And if it doesn't, then basically you shut the company down. The other is you can launch every year and launch something that's a more incremental step, but proves out a certain part of the technology and is not such a big risk at the end. We've taken the second approach, which is we're launching incrementally. So first launch is going up in November this year. That's going to have the first H100s on board. It will be about 100 times more powerful GPU compute than has been in space before. The second one is going up in October next year. That's going to be significant, about an order of magnitude more power generation. And we'll have the first Blackwell architecture from NVIDIA. That one will be the first one that provides a commercial service. But to be very frank, we are taking an approach where we want to generate cash from the second satellite onwards. We're aiming to generate more cash than it costs us to design, build, and launch that satellite. I mean, also, to be fair, we're doing it pretty cheaply. Like the first satellite, we raised a $2.5 million pre-seed, and the whole of the first satellite we've designed, built, and will launch for that $2.5 million, which is like dirt cheap compared to any other space startup I've ever heard of. The second one, we can do with the seed money that we raised. So yeah, I mean, the plan is essentially always to have enough cash to be able to survive the next 2 launches at any given time. So right now we have enough cash to get through till mid-2027. That gets us through the second launch at the end of next year. But yeah, so we'll basically try and raise after the first launch. And if for some reason there to be a failure on the first launch, we are not then totally screwed. We haven't then enough cash to be able to get through to the one after. But yeah, I'd broadly say that our investors are supportive, and I think they're supportive because it de-risks it a lot for them if we can iterate quickly rather than if we have to wait until there's one big one and we have all of this risk on just one satellite.
And in this process, I assume that you already have prospects or people that you collaborate together. Maybe could you little bit open the door for us to see how you do the launches in a way the people are also getting convinced, yes, I would like to do this together with Starcloud. As much as it sounds very ambitious, it's actually surprising to figure out how many other initiatives out there at the same time. So I would be very keen to understand your differentiation and how you hook your prospects to co-build this together, because they are also part, your early customers are part of the equation. And then how many of them are you collaborating? Are you very much like one but real good one, or a little bit of handful of set of customers at the same time?
Yeah. So the initial customer set are people that will pay for the R&D upfront, and the only people that do that are not really commercial customers, because commercial, they want to see a product on orbit before they pay. So it's mainly DoD, so Department of Defense in the US, and government satellites, where there's all of these different programs for funding R&D as you go through that journey. For example, the SBIR program, that's the main people that we're working with for the first few iterations of the satellite is Space Force, Space Development Agency, AFRL, Air Force Research Lab, Space Commercial Office, TAC SRT, a bunch of these guys, DIU, Defense Innovation Unit. It's mainly defense, to be frank, because the first iterations of the satellite, we are providing an edge workload for other satellites. So we're providing cloud and edge services for other military and commercial satellites. That business on its own can close without needing very low launch costs from Starship. And in terms of competitors, there's lots of people putting various levels of compute on orbit. As I understand, we're the only ones putting terrestrial data center grade GPUs on orbit, so things like H100s. Everybody else is putting, Jetson, Orin, or other types of sort of space rated or space grade or ruggedized chips, which are much more reliable, but about 100 times less performant in terms of compute capacity.
Yeah, and among I also have the understanding, because of the latency, your use cases might change as well. Maybe if you can tell us a little bit of your priority use cases, which ones are your first points? Because at the same time, SpaceX has many initiatives around reducing the latency as much as physics can allow. That will be very interesting. Also, this is one of the parts define your prospects as well, if I'm not mistaken, so that they know what to expect from that. Like a gaming company would probably not be the very first to go.
Yeah, true. No, I wouldn't say for the first 3 or 4 years, we're not really competing at all for terrestrial workloads. So when people talk about latency, they're talking about sub 20 millisecond latency through Starlink. And that allows you to do gaming, for example. This is honestly not really not really related to the first few iterations of the satellite. Later, it will become relevant for sure. The first few iterations of the satellite, we're mainly talking with Earth observation satellites who produce enormous amounts of data on orbit. So what they currently do, so for example, Black Sky or Planet Labs or Spire, or maybe not Spire, but any of these Earth observation constellations, is they will take an image and then they will have to wait, or they'll take lots of images. They will then have to wait for a ground station, and that could take half an hour before they get to a ground station. Then they'll downlink as much imagery as they can, which usually is about 1% of the total imagery that they can take, because there's very constrained links between space and ground using this RF antennas. So that's our main first customer set. We will connect with those customers using a very high bandwidth optical terminal in space. So space to space optical is has a much higher bandwidth than space to ground RF, and also space to space optical. You don't have to wait for a ground station. So we'll essentially take enormous amounts of raw imagery from customer satellites, process it on orbit. So, for example, run an inference workload. So let's say, for example, there's a satellite wants to detect wildfires in California. So it has a constellation which is continuously passing over California. Right now, they're just taking petabytes of imagery of just green forest, essentially. And they have to wait till they get all that imagery to the ground before they can run any inference on that to see if there's a forest fire in a certain location. In future, they'll be able to ship all of that imagery to us. We run the inference workload, and then we just, in near real time, we can downlink the insight. And the insight might be, there is a fire in this location moving in this speed and direction. So when we talk about latency, we're talking about, instead of waiting an hour and a half to get your data back, you might wait 1 second to get your information back.
Yeah, got it. I'm gonna slowly phase out so that people will have the chance to be talking to you. My very last question before I say Cameron is over to you. What is the most contrarian thinking you hold in the space? And it still surprises people, whoever back you, and even maybe sometimes within your team.
One thing which people are not really aware of is there will come a time in the not too distant future, within our lifetimes, probably in the next 50 years, where building data centers on Earth becomes impractical, even if we solve nuclear fusion and we have almost free unlimited energy terrestrially. There will come a time when the sheer waste heat that we're pumping out from these data centers is enough to warm the Earth to the point where you're either boiling the oceans or making the planet extremely uninhabitable. And it's on the order of between 10 and 100 times the current energy capacity we're using for data centers. And so whether we like it or not, if we want to scale compute beyond a certain point, and as I said, it's around between 10 and 100 times the current capacity, we will have to figure out building data centers in space, because this is the only place you can dissipate that heat in infrared into the vacuum of space. I think not many people are aware of this or see this as a significant problem right now. But I think over time, on a sort of 20-year time frame at least, this will become very apparent.
That's very delightful. I really don't understand how the time is passing. Celine, do you have any other question before we open up for a roundtable?
I had a few, but you already covered pretty much all of them, and I see a lot of very interesting questions on the chat. So maybe we can open up the Q&A and then everyone start, asking their own questions. They seem very interesting.
That sounds like a good plan. Guys, why don't you raise your hands and we ask you to pose your own question.
So I think what I'm going to do is just take a few questions we already have and then unmute the members that have asked those questions. And then, like you say, if anyone can raise hands or type any new questions in the chat, and we'll kind of reach out to you as we go through. Hopefully they'll flow into each other, but we'll see how it goes.
And it would be cool if people could put their camera on when they ask a question as well, so I know who's speaking.
Absolutely agree. So I'm going to go to Working Satellite as the name in the guest chat. Apologies if I don't have your actual name there. So I'm just going to ask you to unmute, and I've noticed your videos there, so hopefully that will be coming through in a second.
So, hello, I'm Andreas.
Andres.
I'm from Germany. I'm from the economy. So we are in space as a service enabler for the non-space industry. So it's really interesting for the data centers. And I have two questions here because we have also a little bit of research for the data centers in space. And first question here so do you deliver as a Starcloud the end-to-end compute infrastructure, or did you only will provide the whole infrastructure like the satellite panels and the containers, but the CPUs and hardware monitoring is something like that will do Google or Amazon, or is it your service?
Great question. I will answer it aspirationally. Ideally, we do not do anything inside the box. So we would like to be considered more like an energy provider than a data center provider. So we are in the process of signing a very large LOI with the biggest data center builder in the US, where essentially we will provide an Earth-like environment with power, cooling, and connectivity. And whatever anybody wants to do with that, we'll provide power at, let's say, 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And whatever anybody wants to do with that is up to them. The biggest cost, as I say, by a mile is the cost of the chips. And we would much rather not be in the game of financing and operating these for people who have very strong opinions about how they want them to be operated. So yeah, we would rather not be doing that. In the initial days, we have to do that because nobody else knows how to do this stuff on space at the moment. But yeah, over time, I hope we don't do that.
Okay. And the second question, because we are German, we are looking for problems. What is your strategy for the space debris? So is these large infrastructure is this movable, or what you will avoid for the space parts?
Yeah. I mean, essentially, you want to avoid the congested parts of space, which is between about 400 to 800 kilometers altitude. So for the first two satellites we're flying, what's called BLEO, very low Earth orbit, around 350 kilometers. What's called a self-cleaning orbit, because anything there deorbits naturally within a couple of months because you have low levels of drag from the upper atmosphere. For later iterations, we'll be flying around 1,200 kilometers. Nobody really wants to fly there because you're fairly deep in the Van Allen radiation belt at that point. We need to fly there because it's where it's the lowest point where in a dawn dusk sun-synchronous orbit we won't experience, say, an eclipse. So for continuous power, it's important for us to fly there. We will have some maneuverability capabilities, not massive, to be fair. Now that doesn't really solve against micrometeorites. It solves for orbital debris, but it doesn't really solve for micrometeorites. And so the main components, things like the chips, will need to have significant shielding to stop the impact of tiny bits of fragments. Things like the solar panels and the radiators will have to have some tolerance for allowing things to pass through. Particularly the solar panels will allow tiny fragments to pass through. But it's pretty similar to the ISS. I mean, the ISS has had to deal with micrometeorites and orbital debris for the last 20 years, and I don't think they've ever had a serious failure on that regard.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
What I'm going to do is, I know the other Philip Johnston had a question that just ties into what we were speaking, and then I'll come back to a few of the other questions that were already posted. But thank you very much for that input there, and I will just reach out to you, Philip, to unmute.
Yeah. Hey, good to see Phil.
Great name.
Yeah, it's a good one, right? We've had some interactions on this past. I had a question. It just got me thinking, and you know that I know very little this industry in general, but so building on your comment, the long-term heat waste problem for terrestrial compute, what do you see as being the constraints that will eventually cause you to have to graduate the 4x4 unit, the 4x4 kilometer design that's sort of your current long-term goal? What happens next after that? Is there a point where space becomes an issue in space because there's just too many people building your Earth orbit, or is there I understand that our comprehension of how big that space is actually is, right, is often skewed. So is that not actually a real problem for like the next 100 years? Or I think I'm just curious, or is there even a point where heat radiation into space in near orbit becomes an issue because of crowding or something? Just super curious.
Yeah. I like this type of question. I like thinking on like 50 to 100 year time frames. I think before about 10x the total current data centers capacity, we are fine in terms of where we can put data centers in low Earth orbit. Like it's actually very difficult to imagine how much space there is in low Earth orbit, because you're scaling in 3 dimensions and not just imagine the surface area of the Earth, but in 3 dimensions. I mean, that's absolutely massive, the amount of space there is in low Earth orbit. You also have to manage because they're all whizzing around. You have to manage the flight paths and everything, but there is enormous amounts of space. Beyond that, we would start putting, especially for low latency or for things that workloads that don't require low latency. For example, many agentic workflows, that if it takes 15 minutes, it doesn't, for an agentic workflow to run, which it does right now. If you put something in Grok 4 Heavy, it takes 15 minutes. It doesn't matter if you add an extra 3 seconds to put, like the round trip to the moon is about, is on the order of, or the round trip to geostationary orbit is on the order of a few seconds. And beyond that, if you added 10 seconds to get to the moon and back, that's fine. It wouldn't really make much difference to a 15-minute workload. So there are many other orbits where you can place things. The 2 that come to mind would be the first and second Lagrange point. First Lagrange point being closer to the sun, second Lagrange point being further away from the sun. I expect we'll be building very large structures there. And then beyond that, you could put things in the third and fourth Lagrange point, which are in a sun orbit, but with a fixed position relative to the Earth. And so, you can build absolutely massive megastructures in those Lagrange points as well. And then beyond that, we might just start putting stuff in a sun orbit, just a regular old sun orbit. That's where we start to build. That's where the promise of a proper Dyson sphere starts to come.
That's what I was going to try and get you to say. When does this become something really, really enormous like that?
I think we're talking. I think within 15 years, within 50 years, people will start seriously talking about Dyson spheres. I think you're talking a few thousand years to build something meaningful, especially with the rate of increase of the rate of the progress is increasing at a very rapid rate. So, and the rate that progress increases is increasing. So I think within 1,000 years, we could start seeing very meaningful steps towards a Dyson sphere. Within 100,000 years, I think it's pretty inevitable that we'll have something resembling a Dyson sphere. Unless AI watches out first, which I actually think is probably the most likely out.
Awesome, thank you.
Perfect. So what I will do is I will reach out to Mahi, who I know has had a question there for a while. So if you want to unmute, and we can go ahead and have your question.
I'm unmuted. Hey, Philip. Nice to meet you finally. We have been chatting a little bit on LinkedIn. Nice to meet you.
Great to meet you, Mahi.
Yeah. So really nice to see Starcloud's progress. Just had 2 questions. One is, since you are building the reference design with the 5 gigawatt being the reference design, is that correct? Right?
I think it's unlikely we'll have a 5 gigawatt data center before 2035. So what we're really focused on right now is like a 100 kilowatt.
No, that's fine. Do you mean your idea? Yeah, that's fine. Those are all the experiments, right? No, that's still an experimentation. Your actual reference design, the long term is 5 gigawatts. Is that correct? So what is the
the reason we put 5 gigawatts is because it's like 10 times the largest current data center on Earth. So it was very arbitrarily chosen. It's not like a scientific number. We put basically, okay, what's the biggest data center on Earth currently? It's about 500 megawatts. Okay, let's show a data center 10 times that size. That's where the 5 gigawatts came from.
Yeah, I know. But actually, in the law of large numbers, as you scale, you can kind of optimize things, right? What is the tonnage looking like for a 5 gigawatt data center in space? How many tons, with all the parts combined? What is the tonnage?
It's around 40,000 tons.
Okay.
So it's around 100 Starship launches.
100. Yeah, that was my second question. So basically, it's 40,000 tons and 100
Wait,
Starship.
hang on, sorry. Sorry, no. Yeah, around 100. Wait, sorry. No, around 10,000 to around 10,000 tons. Sorry.
Around 10,000 Starship launches.
No, 100 Starship launches. Around depends on which iteration, the V2 or the V3 Starship you're talking about. But yeah, you're talking about on the order of 10 to 20,000 tons, which is on the order of 100 Starship launches, depending on which version of Starship you're talking about.
Okay, cool. That's clear. So 20,000 tonnage and about 100 Starship launches, correct?
Yes, yeah, because it's about 100 tons, between 100 and 200 tons per Starship launch.
Cool. What is your biggest hunch or challenge in actually moving the parts to space? Apart from the cost factor, right? I mean, cost is one factor, of course, but apart from just moving the stuff into space, what do you think will be the biggest challenge?
Let me give you a quick comparison. The entire International Space Station launch cost was around $60 billion for the entire International Space Station. One Starship V2 can launch the whole International Space Station with one launch. And one launch, the marginal cost for SpaceX on that is $5 million. So $60 billion is what the ISS cost to launch. With Starship, $5 million. That's the reduction in launch cost that we're about to see with the new launch vehicles coming online. That's the only reason this business is possible, by the way, for the long term competing with terrestrial data centers, is that the launch cost is about to come down by an insane amount, and the launch capacity is about to go up by an even more insane amount. But the main constraints on launch are, we need Starship to work essentially, and we need or Starship or New Glenn or Stoke Space or any of the others. So, Neutron rocket from Rocket Lab. These things need to work.
Cool, awesome. Thank you so much for the questions.
No worries.
Yeah, thank you.
I know we've got about 3 or 4 questions already posted, so I'm going to limit it to those to kind of fill out the last 10 minutes. We know you've got a hard stop on the hour, Philip. So first off, I'll go to Chris, and you can ask your question.
Hey, look,
I think I saw it. I think I saw it. It looked like a good one.
Yeah.
What is? Sorry.
Yeah.
How you doing?
Good. Enjoying the AMA. What is the worst take that you've received on data centers in space? Preferably if it's not kooky. You get this industry.
Yeah, the worst take. I feel a bit bad calling it the worst take because it's it's rooted in something that makes sense. But the biggest misunderstanding that people have is we should build data centers in space because space is cold. That's probably it's like that. It's like the meme of like the smart guy and the dumb and the midwit meme. Like this is like the bad take, but it's also the very smart take. But we should build data center in space with very cold. But it's not for the reason that the people who say that think it is. It's because it's actually extremely difficult to cool stuff in a vacuum. So it's much more difficult to cool stuff in a vacuum than it is to cool stuff in an atmosphere. And so it requires just an enormous amount of engineering to make the radiator work. I'm not sure. Is that what you mean by a bad take?
That's one of it. But maybe from the investor standpoint, what a critique that was just wholeheartedly, wow, this group or this VC really doesn't understand this market or this technology.
Lots of people don't know the difference between geostationary orbit and low Earth orbit. So sometimes I get a VC saying, when I use a satellite phone, it takes 2 seconds before I get an answer. And I have to then explain to them the difference between geostationary and low Earth orbit. Maybe that's one of the more common. Because low Earth orbit, you're not going to have any latency. It's like sub 20 milliseconds using Starlink, for example. But anybody that hasn't used Starlink yet has this old school mindset of geostationary communication satellites, which are the ones that are very far away, like 30,000 kilometers away, and they have this crazy delay. So sometimes people ask me about that. Lots of people ask me about the Chinese shooting down our satellite, which is not a crazy thing to ask, I guess. But my response is it's a lot easier to shoot down a data center in Seattle than it is to shoot down a data center in space.
Or I'm not sure.
Or just cut power, yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. Appreciate the question, Chris. I'll open it to Bertrand, if that's okay, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes. Hello, Philip. So yeah, my question would be more in general about big infrastructures. Of course, as you mentioned, the launch costs are reducing drastically, and we talk a lot more about big infrastructures, of course, with Starcloud, but also for bit manufacturing with Border Space, or Space Forge also in the UK. Which other application, in your opinion, will benefit the most from bit infrastructures in the future?
The one that will benefit the most from low launch cost in particular is asteroid mining and lunar mining. With low launch cost, that business case closes and it will generate trillions of dollars of wealth for somebody or some group of people. Yeah, asteroid mining will be a big thing with low launch cost.
Thank you.
All right, and then I think I will leave our last question to Glenn. If you want to unmute, I know there are.
Hey, Glenn.
Yeah,
I saw you're on there. It's great to see some familiar faces.
Well, man. And yeah, by the way, the latency to the moon for lunar mining is 3 seconds round trip. So, and about 2
Yeah, right.
to jail. We know because look at this. So yeah, great. We can talk about all the technical challenges, etc. But I think I wanted to touch base on the capital costs of each of your modular units. I know that you've probably got pretty good models for your 100 kilowatt unit and scaling up and probably coming down the curve as you scale to your larger manufacturing throughput, etc. But I just thought, what is your modular capital requirements? And initially, obviously, you're extraordinary. $2.5 million for one bird is just effing mind blowing for starters. So congrats on that. But as you get to these large scale shipping container sized units, what's your target CAPEX? And are you aggregating up to the 5 gigawatts? Because I know from Wall Street that $2.5 billion is kind of their sweet spot for hyperscalers as they build out data centers.
Interesting
on that point.
Yeah, so that's a good reference point. So I think I once did the calculation on a 5 gigawatt data center. The chips alone on a 5 gigawatt data center are around $20 billion. And that kind of ties in, I guess. We got 500 megawatt data center, $2 billion. Well, no, maybe it's slightly more. Anyway, so the biggest cost by a mile is the chips. But you're right. For the larger, when we get to this 40 megawatt module, we're looking to do everything as dirt cheaply as possible, because at that point, mass becomes less of a constraint. And so, for example, if we have to use literally steel corrugated plates for the outside of this thing, we'll do that. And we're targeting an all-in cost, including the solar panels and radiators, for the satellite structure itself of around $30 million. So that doesn't include the chips, internal cooling architecture, or anything else. It's just the radiator, satellite, and box. And then a launch cost of, if it was $100 a kilo, that would be $10 million launch cost. So $40 million for the structure, but then, as you say, much larger cost if you include the cost of the chips and the cooling architecture inside. But that's roughly equivalent to what you're seeing with terrestrial data centers.
Yep. On a related point, then, because these are affordable costs, you got the cost of money becomes an issue. And actually, we're working with Exim to get them to qualify space as an export market for the U.S.
Exim great. Yeah, we would love to. We would love that to be a thing.
Yeah. You leverage that from Exim, which will lower overall the cost of money. So anyway, I'm sure we can talk much more about that. So Thank you.
Awesome.
Amazing answer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Perfect. So I'd like to thank everyone for all the questions. Any that we didn't quite get to, we can obviously have a look at and then maybe relay back to Philip at a later point. I will pass to Nihal now for some closing remarks so that Philip can make his next meeting. And then just for all the participants, if you can stay on, we just have a quick poll to understand how we're doing and how we can do it better in the future.
All right. Thanks so much, Cameron. Thanks, everyone. And Philip, it was a pleasure to have you today with us around especially such a deep tech builders room. And before we close it, what would be the one thing that you would want to ask everyone to keep in their mind based on your experience so far? You, because played in multiple different fields, not only deep tech, but also in the other industries. So therefore, I think it would be quite nice and inspirational to keep at the top of our heads when we are building something. Somebody looks and says, "Are you sure? Would that take off?"
Now is a really great time to be building a deep tech company. Despite what people say, maybe some people say the fundraising environment is not good for certain types of businesses. It is a great fundraising environment right now for deep tech. And the reason is VCs are quite scared to put money into SaaS and other things that are going to get destroyed by AI. And they think that physical things are much less disruptable in the short term. So I would, so keep at it. Now's a good time.
Super lovely. And we will be very respectful to your time. We are finishing it with 1 minute gifting to you. Thanks so much. Let's stay in touch.
For sure. Thanks everyone for joining.